Ronald Reagan became the 40th President of the United States, serving from 1981 through 1989, and according to the WhiteHouse.gov, his term saw a restoration of prosperity at home with the goal of achieving peace through strength abroad. Ronald Reagan's 2 terms in office left the nation enjoying its longest record period of peacetime prosperity without a recession or depression, according to the WhiteHouse.gov. Ronald Reagan, a former actor, became president on January 20th, 1981, and only after being in office for 69 days there was an assassination attempt on his life. Once Reagan had recovered from the gunshot, he refused to back down from the presidency and became one of the most iconic presidents of all time. Today I'm going to tell you about one of the greatest presidents we've ever had and show how this man helped the United States of America reach #1 amongst other countries in the world. First, let me tell you about Ronald Reagan's accomplishments during his early years of presidency. Ronald Reagan's tax recovery and tax reform helped stimulate the economy of the United States. Reagan's 1981 Economic Tax Recovery Act introduced a reduction of 25% to all taxes across the board, in which everyone got a reduction. Almost all supply-siders supported indexing taxes for inflation to end bracket creep, and to prevent the government from profiting off inflation, according to Edwin Fielner. The tax reform of 1986 was sequential to Reagan, for he knew that the closing loopholes and lowering rates would create efficiency gains. This act eliminated deductions and helped the lower class. As a result, this act, the highest tax rate fell from 70% to 28%, which is one of the biggest tax reductions according to Edmund Fielner. Reagan understood that high taxes meant discouraging the work environment because people felt more of their money was going to fund the government. In fact, Reagan quoted in one of his interviews that as an actor he would only do a certain number of movies a year because at a certain point the taxes would become too great and he would not make as much money. According to Fielner, the Reagan tax reductions increased tax revenues from $500 billion to $1 trillion by the end of the 1980s. Now I'm going to discuss his foreign policy and influence towards other countries. During the Reagan administration, the nation was in the Cold War with the Soviet Union, which is a war that involved no fighting but instead a mass increase in warfare technology. Reagan sought to end the Cold War by increasing technology so much that the Soviet Union could not keep up. Reagan increased the amount we spend on our military by 35%. Reagan basically caused the Soviet Union's economy to crash while they tried to keep up with the United States. Research from the New York Times even shows that Reagan was able to successfully escort oil ships out of the Persian Gulf during the Iran and Iraq War. Reagan set up a blockade of naval ships to escort oil ships out of the Gulf so that the nation would not suffer any oil shortages. Ronald Reagan even challenged Gorbachev to tear down the Berlin Wall, and when he did tear down the wall, this opened up negotiations with the Soviet Union to address the threat of nuclear weapons which both sides created during the Cold War. In December 1987, Reagan and Gorbachev signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which eliminated nuclear missiles from Europe. These acts show us that Ronald Reagan not only did wonders to the United States, but he also did wonders to the rest of the world. Finally, I want to tell you about the Reagan Doctrine, which influenced in defeating communism. The Reagan Doctrine enacted aid to anti-communist parties around the world and showed the rest of the world the United States' view on communism as evil. As stated by Charles Krauthammer, the Reagan Doctrine basically declares American support for anti-communist revolution on every continent. At this time in history, the Soviet Union was trying to recruit underdeveloped countries into joining their empire as long as they practiced communism. Well, the United States would send aid to indigenous people or support groups to help fight back against the Soviet Union. At this time in history, we are trying to crush the Soviet Union economically rather than by force, and cannot allow them to gain access to new materials. After World War II, we saw the expansion of communism and even dealt with it during the Vietnam War. This doctrine was a way to fight communism without the cost of our own troops. According to Charles Krauthammer, the Reagan Doctrine was a counter to the Bernays Doctrine, which declares that once a Soviet accusation, always a Soviet accusation. We had to have some form of terms to counter the Soviets and make sure they were not gaining support or resources. Today I have told you some of the major impacts that Ronald Reagan has had to help turn the United States into a superpower and help develop the rest of the world. I hope I have informed you what Ronald Reagan has to do to transform a country into a superpower like it is today. And I hope you can now see all the things that were easy. Some of these things were not easy. They took hard work and dedication to get them done. After the Reagan administration, the United States experienced a time of peace and economic growth, which has not been seen in the country since then. Ronald Reagan ended the Cold War with the Soviet Union and turned the United States into one of the few superpowers that we have on this planet.